A wedding dress stained with tears, a blind groom everyone laughed at, and a bride who walked toward the altar because refusing meant losing everything her family had ever owned. The guests smiled politely while whispering cruel predictions about a marriage that could never survive. They believed the young woman had been sold to a broken man. They believed the blind stranger would spend the rest of his life hidden behind pity and silence. None of them knew that before many bright afternoons had passed, the truth buried for years would shake one of the richest families in the country, exposing betrayal so deep that it would change every life standing in that garden forever. Before this emotional journey continues, if you believe kindness is stronger than pride, forgiveness is greater than revenge, hope can bloom even after heartbreak, and everyone deserves a second chance, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs encouragement today, and subscribe to our channel so our family can continue bringing you stories that touch the heart. Cecilia Rowan had always believed that honest work could overcome almost any hardship. She had spent her childhood helping her parents maintain their small orchard on the edge of a peaceful valley where every morning the sunlight painted the rows of fruit trees with golden warmth. Her father, Roland Rowan, often reminded her that wealth could disappear in a single season, but integrity stayed with a person forever. Cecilia treasured those words because they were all her family truly possessed after years of failed harvests, rising debts, and dishonest business partners left them struggling to survive. They never complained. They simply worked harder each day, hoping tomorrow would finally reward their perseverance. Everything changed one clear afternoon when Roland collapsed while trying to repair an irrigation system damaged during a dry summer. The doctor explained that years of exhaustion had weakened his heart and that continuing to work under such pressure could cost him his life. Cecilia watched her once energetic father lie quietly beside a hospital window while warm sunlight streamed across the room, and for the first time she felt completely powerless. Medical bills arrived faster than they could be paid. Notices from creditors covered the kitchen table. Their orchard, which had belonged to the Rowan family for generations, was scheduled to be seized within weeks unless an impossible amount of money could somehow be found. Friends offered sympathy but little practical help because many of them struggled themselves. Cecilia searched tirelessly for better employment, taking every daytime job she could find. She worked in bakeries before sunrise, delivered flowers through the afternoon, and organized records for a small accounting office whenever there was extra work available. Every evening she returned home exhausted, yet the debts continued growing. No matter how many hours she worked beneath the bright sky, the numbers never became smaller. One afternoon an expensive black car rolled slowly into the orchard. The driver opened the rear door, allowing an elderly gentleman dressed with quiet elegance to step onto the gravel path. His silver hair reflected the sunlight, but it was the sadness in his eyes that immediately caught Cecilia's attention. He introduced himself as Theodore Ashcombe, founder of one of the country's oldest business empires. His reputation for discipline and success was known everywhere, but there was nothing arrogant about the way he greeted Cecilia's family. Instead, he spoke gently, as though carrying a burden much heavier than his wealth. Theodore explained that he had come with an unusual proposal. He had a grandson named Julian Ashcombe who had lost his eyesight several years earlier after surviving a terrible accident that also claimed the lives of his parents. Since that tragedy, Julian had withdrawn from public life while other relatives slowly assumed control of the family businesses. Theodore feared his grandson had lost all faith in people. More than anything, he wanted someone kind enough to stand beside Julian without seeing him as a burden. The offer stunned Cecilia. Theodore promised that every debt would be erased immediately. Her father's medical care would be fully covered. The family orchard would remain theirs forever. In return, Cecilia would marry Julian in a private ceremony within 2 weeks. The room fell silent. Roland immediately refused, insisting that his daughter could never be treated as payment for financial problems. Cecilia's mother, Eleanor, began crying because she knew such an opportunity would never come again. Cecilia herself could barely breathe. Every instinct told her that marriage should begin with love, not desperation. Yet every glance toward her recovering father reminded her what refusing might cost. Theodore never pressured her. He quietly admitted that he understood the unfairness of the request. He simply believed Julian deserved someone whose heart valued compassion over appearances. If Cecilia declined, he promised there would be no anger. For 3 long afternoons Cecilia wandered through the orchard alone, touching the trees planted by her grandparents decades earlier. She remembered climbing those branches as a child, laughing beneath the summer sun while her parents watched proudly. She imagined the land sold to strangers, her father blaming himself until his health failed completely, and her mother carrying unbearable guilt. Every path she considered seemed to lead toward heartbreak. On the 4th afternoon she made her decision. She would marry the blind stranger. Not because she desired wealth. Not because she expected happiness. But because love for her family demanded a sacrifice she never imagined making. News spread quickly throughout the valley. Some neighbors admired her courage. Others whispered that she had exchanged freedom for money. A few cruel voices suggested that marrying a blind man would condemn her to a lifetime of loneliness. Cecilia listened without defending herself. She knew no explanation would satisfy people determined to judge what they did not understand. The wedding was held in the garden surrounding the Ashcombe estate beneath brilliant afternoon sunshine. Everything reflected quiet elegance rather than extravagant display. White roses lined the pathways. Gentle music drifted through the warm air. Wealthy guests gathered beneath decorative canopies, observing the ceremony with polite smiles that often concealed curiosity or pity. Then Cecilia saw Julian for the first time. He stood calmly near the front of the garden, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, holding a polished white cane. His face carried remarkable dignity despite the obvious sadness resting behind it. His eyes, though unable to see, remained peaceful rather than bitter. He thanked every person who guided him with sincere warmth and somehow remembered each person's voice after hearing it only once. The whispers among the guests became louder. Some pitied Cecilia. Others pitied Julian. Very few believed either of them could ever find happiness. When the ceremony ended, applause echoed politely through the garden, but it lacked genuine celebration. Most people viewed the marriage as a business arrangement that would eventually fail. Only Theodore smiled with quiet hope. Afterward Cecilia expected awkwardness during the drive to the estate. Instead, Julian surprised her by asking thoughtful questions about her family, her orchard, and the small joys she missed most. He listened carefully whenever she described the valley, the colors of the fruit trees, or the sound of birds gathering during warm afternoons. He never complained about his blindness. He never spoke with self-pity. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in seeing the world through the details she shared. The Ashcombe estate was enormous, yet strangely quiet. Employees treated Julian respectfully, but Cecilia noticed something unsettling. They often looked toward another member of the family before answering even simple questions. That man was Victor Ashcombe. Victor was Theodore's nephew and currently managed nearly every company under the Ashcombe name. He greeted Cecilia with flawless manners and a polished smile that appeared sincere at first glance. Yet something in his expression changed whenever Julian entered the room. It was subtle, almost invisible, but unmistakable. Behind the pleasant smile lived irritation, perhaps even fear. During dinner Victor casually remarked that Julian preferred a peaceful life away from complicated business matters. Theodore remained silent. Julian simply continued eating without responding. Cecilia sensed years of unspoken history hidden beneath that single comment. Over the following weeks Cecilia slowly adjusted to life inside the estate. Every morning she described the sunrise from the gardens while Julian listened with quiet appreciation. They walked beneath the afternoon sunshine through rows of flowers where he counted each turn from memory. She discovered that his sense of direction was astonishing. Although unable to see, he knew every pathway by touch, every fountain by sound, and every tree by its fragrance. One afternoon she accidentally stumbled while crossing a stone walkway. Before she could fall, Julian caught her hand with remarkable speed. He smiled gently. Cecilia realized he had sensed her movement before anyone else noticed. For the first time since their marriage, she forgot that he could not see. She simply saw the man. As the days passed, she discovered even more remarkable qualities. Julian spoke several languages fluently. He remembered entire books after hearing them once. He recognized people's emotions through tiny changes in their breathing. Employees naturally relaxed around him because he treated every gardener, cleaner, driver, and assistant with equal kindness. Yet despite all his intelligence, he remained excluded from every important business decision. Victor attended board meetings. Victor signed major contracts. Victor represented the family publicly. Julian rarely received updates unless Theodore personally informed him. One bright afternoon Cecilia entered the estate library searching for gardening books she hoped to send home to her parents. While reaching for a dusty volume on an upper shelf, she accidentally knocked over a small wooden box hidden behind several old ledgers. The box struck the floor. Its lid opened. Yellow documents scattered across the polished wood. Cecilia knelt to gather them, but one page immediately caught her attention. Her heart began beating faster. She had no idea that the forgotten papers lying beneath years of dust would become the first piece of a mystery capable of destroying decades of carefully hidden lies. Cecilia carefully gathered every scattered document from the polished library floor, believing she had simply discovered forgotten family records. Yet the moment she looked more closely, an uneasy feeling settled over her. The papers were far older than she expected, some carrying faded signatures, official seals, and handwritten notes in the margins. She had no legal training, but she recognized one name repeated throughout nearly every page: Julian Ashcombe. His name appeared beside references to trusts, voting rights, family ownership, and inheritance. What puzzled her most was that several documents clearly identified Julian as the principal successor to Theodore's entire business empire, while others, dated months later, dramatically reduced his authority in favor of Victor Ashcombe. The signatures looked strangely different. Even someone unfamiliar with handwriting could see that something did not match. She quietly placed the documents back inside the wooden box and returned them to the hidden shelf before anyone entered the library. Throughout the afternoon she struggled to focus on anything else. Every smile from Victor suddenly felt rehearsed. Every polite conversation carried new meaning. She remembered the way employees always looked toward Victor before answering Julian, the way board meetings continued without the rightful grandson, and Theodore's lingering sadness whenever family matters arose. Small moments that once seemed ordinary now fit together like pieces of an unfinished puzzle. That afternoon, while the warm sun bathed the gardens in soft golden light, Cecilia joined Julian during his daily walk. He immediately sensed something troubling her. Although he could not see the worry on her face, years of depending upon other senses had made him extraordinarily observant. He noticed the hesitation in her footsteps, the uneven rhythm of her breathing, and the silence that replaced her usual cheerful descriptions of blooming flowers. After several minutes of quiet walking, Cecilia finally told him about the documents. Julian stopped walking. For several long moments he said nothing. His expression remained calm, but Cecilia noticed his fingers tighten around the handle of his white cane. He explained that after the accident that claimed his parents, he had spent months recovering in hospitals. During that time lawyers, accountants, and relatives handled every family matter without him. Theodore assured him everything was being managed responsibly while he focused on healing. When his eyesight never returned, doctors encouraged him to adapt to a completely different life. Business responsibilities slowly disappeared from conversations until Victor naturally became the public face of the Ashcombe empire. Julian admitted he had questioned the arrangement years earlier, but every legal advisor insisted the documents were legitimate. Eventually he accepted that perhaps blindness truly made him unfit to lead. Cecilia felt her heart ache. The greatest injustice had not been stealing Julian's inheritance. It had been convincing him he deserved to lose it. That realization changed everything inside her. She no longer saw herself merely as his wife fulfilling an obligation. She wanted the truth. Not for money. Not for status. But because no decent person deserved to have their confidence stolen along with their future. The following afternoon Cecilia returned to the library while Victor attended meetings downtown. She searched carefully through old shelves until she discovered additional storage boxes containing financial reports dating back nearly 15 years. Dust covered every folder, suggesting no one had examined them for a very long time. The reports revealed something alarming. Several profitable companies had been quietly sold far below their value to businesses secretly connected to Victor. Other properties had disappeared from family ownership through unusually complicated transactions. Large sums of money had been transferred into consulting firms that appeared to exist only on paper. Cecilia photographed every page using her phone before returning everything exactly as she found it. She understood the danger of acting too quickly. That evening Theodore invited Julian and Cecilia to join him for tea beneath the bright afternoon sky on the estate terrace. The elderly businessman looked unusually tired. Years weighed heavily upon him, and although his mind remained sharp, regret seemed permanently written across his face. Without mentioning the documents directly, Cecilia gently asked whether Theodore ever believed Julian might one day return to leading the family businesses. Theodore looked toward his grandson for a long moment before answering. He admitted that after the accident he had been devastated by losing his son and daughter-in-law. Doctors warned that Julian might never recover emotionally after losing both his parents and his eyesight. Theodore believed protecting his grandson from overwhelming responsibility was an act of love. Victor eagerly offered to manage the companies temporarily until Julian regained confidence. Temporary. The word lingered painfully. Temporary had quietly become permanent. Theodore confessed that over the years he had noticed changes within the businesses that troubled him. Employee loyalty declined. Community charities disappeared. Long-time managers retired unexpectedly. Yet every concern Victor explained away with polished confidence and impressive financial reports. The old man sighed deeply. Success, he admitted, sometimes hides dishonesty better than failure. That single sentence strengthened Cecilia's determination. Over the following weeks she developed a careful routine. Each afternoon she visited the library. Each evening she organized notes. Each morning she read business reports aloud to Julian. Something extraordinary began happening. Julian remembered every number she read. Every date. Every company. Every transaction. He mentally compared new information with reports he had studied years earlier before the accident. Patterns quickly emerged. Companies once producing excellent profits now somehow reported losses immediately before being sold. Land purchased cheaply later appeared inside Victor's private investment group. Executives who questioned financial decisions mysteriously resigned within months. Julian's remarkable memory became more valuable than perfect eyesight. Cecilia often forgot she was reading documents to a blind man. Instead, she felt she was working beside one of the most brilliant business minds she had ever encountered. Their partnership transformed their marriage in quiet, beautiful ways. They spent long afternoons beneath ancient oak trees discussing ideas rather than obligations. Julian listened patiently whenever Cecilia spoke about her childhood in the orchard. She described the scent of apple blossoms carried by warm breezes, the buzzing of bees during spring afternoons, and the joy of eating fruit directly from the trees. Julian smiled often during those conversations. He admitted he had begun seeing those places through her words. Meanwhile Cecilia discovered that Julian possessed an unexpectedly playful sense of humor. Despite years of loneliness, he found ways to laugh at himself. When he occasionally lost count of steps inside unfamiliar gardens, he joked that flowers were becoming surprisingly adventurous. His optimism slowly erased the sadness that had surrounded the estate for years. Employees noticed the difference. Housekeepers smiled more. gardeners greeted Julian with genuine affection. Even the estate's elderly cook remarked that laughter had finally returned to the house. Only Victor appeared increasingly uncomfortable. He watched Julian more carefully during family gatherings. He noticed Theodore requesting his grandson's opinions more frequently. He also noticed Cecilia quietly examining company reports whenever opportunities appeared. One bright afternoon Victor unexpectedly entered the library while Cecilia reviewed archived contracts. She quickly closed the folder before he reached the table. Victor smiled politely. His voice remained calm. Yet something cold lingered beneath every carefully chosen word. He remarked that old paperwork often created unnecessary confusion because many documents reflected business plans that had changed over time. He suggested Cecilia spend more time enjoying married life instead of becoming interested in complicated corporate history. His words sounded friendly. His eyes did not. After he left, Cecilia realized she was no longer simply searching for answers. Someone had begun watching her. That realization made every discovery more dangerous. A few days later another unexpected event deepened the mystery. An elderly groundskeeper named Arthur approached Cecilia while she admired roses in one of the estate gardens during a sunny afternoon. Arthur had worked for the Ashcombe family for over 40 years. His hands were rough from decades of labor, but kindness filled his weathered face. He quietly thanked Cecilia for bringing happiness back into Julian's life. Then, after carefully making sure no one else stood nearby, he revealed something he had never dared tell another person. On the afternoon of the accident that killed Julian's parents, Arthur had seen Victor arguing violently with Julian's father near the estate entrance shortly before they departed. Hours later came news of the fatal crash. Arthur never accused Victor because he possessed no proof. But he never forgot the fear he saw in Julian's father's eyes that afternoon. For years guilt had haunted him. He believed remaining silent had betrayed the family he loved. Cecilia's heart raced. Financial fraud was terrible enough. But if Victor's ambition reached back to the very day Julian lost his parents, the truth might be darker than anyone imagined. As Cecilia looked across the sunlit gardens toward the magnificent Ashcombe mansion, she realized the greatest battle still lay ahead. Someone had stolen an empire. Someone had stolen a grandson's future. And perhaps, someone had stolen 2 innocent lives. She silently promised herself that no matter how powerful Victor appeared, she would not allow another lie to survive beneath the bright daylight that had begun exposing the truth one piece at a time. The days that followed felt unusually peaceful, yet Cecilia knew the calm surrounding the Ashcombe estate was only hiding a gathering storm. Every bright morning began with the same comforting routine as she and Julian walked through the gardens while sunlight shimmered across the fountains and flower beds. To anyone watching, they looked like a couple slowly learning to love each other. Only Cecilia knew that every smile she offered concealed a growing collection of evidence that threatened to destroy the carefully protected image of the Ashcombe family. She no longer feared Victor's influence as much as she feared how far he might go if he discovered that the truth was slipping beyond his control. Julian sensed the change in her long before she admitted it. Although he had accepted blindness years earlier, he had never stopped noticing the smallest changes in the people he loved. He could hear anxiety in the pause before Cecilia answered simple questions. He recognized the weight in her footsteps after she returned from the library. More importantly, he realized she was risking herself for him without expecting anything in return. That realization humbled him more deeply than words could express. For years he had believed he survived only because fate had spared him. He had accepted loneliness because he believed no woman would willingly build a future beside a blind man. He never blamed anyone for thinking that way. He blamed himself. Losing his eyesight had slowly convinced him that he was no longer capable of protecting the people around him. Cecilia quietly shattered that belief. She never guided him because she pitied him. She walked beside him because she trusted him. One warm afternoon they visited the Rowan orchard for the first time since their wedding. Theodore had quietly fulfilled his promise. Every debt had been erased. New irrigation systems had been installed, damaged equipment replaced, and fresh saplings planted across the property. Roland's health had improved remarkably now that constant financial pressure no longer weighed upon him. Eleanor welcomed Julian with genuine affection instead of cautious politeness. She quickly discovered that he insisted on helping despite his blindness. Using only touch and careful instructions from Roland, Julian spent the afternoon sorting freshly harvested apples into wooden crates. At first the workers watched nervously, expecting him to struggle. Instead they were amazed by his patience and precision. By the end of the afternoon the orchard echoed with laughter. For the first time since the wedding, Cecilia looked at Julian without seeing the man she had been forced to marry. She saw the man she would have chosen anyway. That thought frightened her almost as much as it comforted her. Love had arrived quietly, without permission. On the drive back to the estate she remained unusually silent. Julian finally smiled and admitted he could almost hear her thinking. She laughed softly. It was the first carefree laugh either of them had shared together. Meanwhile Victor's confidence continued to weaken. Private investigators he secretly hired reported that Cecilia had been reviewing archived financial records. Several long-time employees who once avoided Julian had begun visiting him regularly to seek advice. Even more alarming, Theodore had postponed naming Victor permanent chairman despite months of preparation. Victor realized something was changing. He simply did not know how much. The following afternoon he called an emergency executive meeting inside the company's headquarters. Senior managers gathered beneath enormous windows overlooking the city while sunlight filled the conference room. Victor announced a sweeping internal restructuring, claiming it would modernize the corporation. In reality, the plan quietly removed several veteran employees who had worked closely with Julian's late father. Among those dismissed was Margaret Ellis. Margaret had served as executive secretary to Julian's parents for nearly 30 years. She had retired shortly after the fatal accident and rarely returned to company affairs. When Cecilia learned of Margaret's sudden dismissal from her consulting role, something felt wrong. She decided to visit the elderly woman the very next afternoon. Margaret lived alone in a quiet countryside cottage surrounded by colorful gardens. Though older now, her memory remained remarkably sharp. At first she seemed hesitant to discuss the past, but after learning that Cecilia had married Julian, tears slowly filled her eyes. She confessed that Julian's father had never trusted Victor. Several weeks before the accident, Julian's father discovered unusual financial transfers involving overseas accounts. He believed someone inside the family was secretly diverting company funds. He intended to present the evidence during the next board meeting. That meeting never happened. Instead, the accident occurred. Margaret reached into an old cabinet and removed a sealed envelope. She explained that Julian's father had asked her to protect it if anything unexpected happened. Fear had kept her silent for years. Now she believed it finally belonged in Julian's hands. Inside the envelope were photocopies of financial records, handwritten notes, and one particularly shocking letter. The letter described growing concern that Victor intended to manipulate future inheritance documents if Theodore ever became emotionally vulnerable. Cecilia's hands trembled. The suspicions they had been uncovering were no longer guesses. Julian's own father had feared exactly what eventually happened. As Cecilia prepared to leave, Margaret offered one final warning. She believed Victor had friends in places far beyond the Ashcombe estate. Lawyers, executives, politicians, people whose loyalty could be purchased. She urged Cecilia to trust only those whose integrity had already been proven. The drive home felt longer than ever. Cecilia understood that exposing Victor would require more than truth. It would require undeniable proof. That evening she showed every document to Julian and Theodore. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally Theodore lowered his head into his hands. His shoulders trembled. The powerful businessman who had spent decades leading one of the country's greatest companies quietly admitted something that haunted him every day. He had failed his own family. His grief after losing his son had blinded him more completely than Julian had ever been blinded by the accident. While mourning one tragedy, he had unknowingly allowed another to unfold. Julian gently placed a hand upon his grandfather's shoulder. He carried no anger. Only compassion. Theodore looked at his grandson with tears in his eyes. For the first time in years he truly saw the leader his son had always believed Julian would become. The next morning Theodore secretly contacted his oldest friend, retired High Court Judge Leonard Barrett. Leonard had been one of the witnesses to the original Ashcombe succession agreement decades earlier. Though long retired, his reputation for honesty remained unquestioned throughout the country. After reviewing the documents, Leonard immediately noticed serious irregularities. Several signatures appeared authentic. Others clearly showed signs of forgery. The inheritance amendments transferring authority to Victor deserved immediate forensic examination. The investigation had officially begun. Victor remained completely unaware. Believing himself secure, he announced a lavish charity gala to be held the following week beneath the afternoon sun at the Ashcombe Foundation Gardens. Nearly every influential business leader, journalist, and shareholder would attend. Victor intended to use the event to strengthen public support before Theodore formally announced the company's future leadership. What Victor did not realize. Theodore had quietly decided that the gala would become something entirely different. Instead of celebrating Victor's rise, it would become the day the truth finally stepped into the light. As preparations continued, danger crept closer. Late one sunny afternoon Cecilia returned to the library intending to secure the remaining evidence before the gala. The hidden wooden box was exactly where she had left it. But something immediately felt wrong. Several folders were missing. Fresh footprints marked the dust on the floor. Someone else had searched the library. And resting neatly in the center of the reading table was a single folded note. No signature. Only one chilling sentence written in careful handwriting. Some secrets should stay buried if you want your family to remain safe. Cecilia stared at the folded note as sunlight poured through the tall library windows, illuminating the threatening words with unsettling clarity. Her heartbeat quickened, but she refused to let fear control her. Whoever had left the message wanted her to panic, to destroy the evidence, or to walk away before the truth reached the public. Instead, she carefully placed the note inside a folder with the other documents. Threats were no longer signs of power. They were signs that someone was afraid. She left the library without telling anyone what had happened until she reached Julian. Sitting together in the estate's west garden beneath the shade of centuries-old oak trees, she quietly handed him the note. He slowly traced the paper with his fingertips, as though trying to understand the emotions behind the handwriting rather than the words themselves. After a long silence, he smiled with unexpected calm. He told Cecilia that fear often speaks the loudest when lies are close to being exposed. Whoever wrote the message had already begun losing control. His confidence strengthened her. That afternoon Theodore summoned only 3 people into his private study: Julian, Cecilia, and Judge Leonard Barrett. Thick folders covered the large wooden desk. Leonard had spent the previous day consulting handwriting experts and reviewing archived legal records. The results were deeply disturbing. The signatures transferring authority to Victor had indeed been forged. The original succession agreement had never been legally replaced. Every amendment giving Victor control over the Ashcombe Empire rested on fraudulent documents. Even more shocking, Leonard discovered that the attorney who certified those forged papers had resigned unexpectedly less than a year later before disappearing overseas. Financial records suggested he had received a large payment shortly before leaving the country. Theodore closed his eyes. Every new revelation confirmed what he had spent years refusing to imagine. His own nephew had not merely taken advantage of tragedy. He had built an empire upon it. The old businessman rose slowly from his chair and walked toward the enormous window overlooking the sunlit gardens. His voice carried quiet sorrow rather than anger as he admitted that the greatest mistake of his life had not been trusting Victor. It had been doubting Julian. For years he believed blindness had taken away his grandson's future. Now he realized blindness had belonged to everyone else. Theodore turned toward Julian and apologized with tears in his eyes. Julian embraced his grandfather without hesitation. Years of misunderstanding quietly dissolved in that single moment. Neither man could recover the years they had lost. But they refused to lose another. Preparations for the charity gala continued throughout the estate. Workers arranged elegant tables across the gardens. Florists filled every pathway with bright blossoms. Musicians rehearsed beneath white canopies while staff welcomed deliveries from across the county. Newspapers announced that influential politicians, investors, journalists, judges, and business leaders would attend what everyone believed was Victor Ashcombe's greatest public triumph. Victor enjoyed every moment of the attention. He welcomed reporters into the estate with polished confidence, speaking about innovation, leadership, and the future of the Ashcombe Foundation. His speeches were flawless. His conscience was not. Meanwhile, Cecilia received another unexpected visitor. Arthur, the elderly groundskeeper, approached her during one peaceful afternoon carrying a weathered metal box he had hidden for many years inside an old maintenance shed. He confessed that guilt had become heavier than fear. Inside the box rested a small camera. Arthur explained that years earlier the estate regularly photographed important family events for company archives. By chance, one of those cameras had captured Victor arguing with Julian's father on the afternoon of the fatal accident. Arthur had secretly kept the undeveloped film after noticing Victor desperately searching for it days later. He had been too frightened to reveal it. Now he believed Julian deserved the truth. The film was immediately delivered to specialists. Hours later the photographs arrived. Every person examining them fell silent. The images clearly showed Victor grabbing Julian's father by the arm near the entrance gates. Their expressions revealed obvious anger. One photograph captured Julian's father pointing toward a folder tucked beneath his arm. Another showed Victor attempting to seize it. The final image revealed Julian's parents driving away only minutes later while Victor watched with unmistakable rage. The photographs did not prove Victor caused the accident. But they destroyed his repeated claim that he had not seen Julian's parents that day. He had lied. For years. Judge Barrett quietly added the photographs to the growing collection of evidence. The next afternoon an even greater surprise arrived. A retired mechanic named Samuel Grayson requested a private meeting with Theodore. Samuel had operated the repair garage responsible for servicing every Ashcombe family vehicle years earlier. After seeing newspaper coverage announcing the upcoming gala, his conscience finally overwhelmed him. He admitted that investigators never inspected one crucial detail after the fatal crash. Several days before the accident, someone claiming to represent Victor had collected Julian's parents' vehicle unexpectedly, insisting urgent maintenance was required. Samuel never performed that maintenance. The vehicle disappeared for nearly 12 hours before being returned. At the time he assumed another authorized garage had completed the work. Only years later did he realize no such service record existed. His testimony raised a terrifying possibility. Perhaps the crash had never been an accident. Judge Barrett urged caution. Without direct evidence, they could not accuse Victor of murder. But the testimony strongly supported reopening the investigation. Theodore immediately contacted authorities. Old case files were officially reopened for forensic review. Victor still knew nothing. His attention remained focused on the gala. The morning of the event arrived beneath brilliant blue skies. Hundreds of guests entered the Ashcombe estate wearing elegant clothing while television crews prepared live broadcasts across the beautifully decorated gardens. Local charities displayed projects funded by the family foundation. Musicians welcomed visitors with gentle orchestral music. Children laughed while exploring colorful displays celebrating decades of community service. Everything appeared perfect. Victor greeted every guest with effortless charm. Reporters praised his leadership. Investors congratulated him. Several influential board members privately assured him that Theodore would surely announce him as permanent chairman before the afternoon concluded. Victor smiled confidently. He believed victory was only moments away. Across the garden, Cecilia stood beside Julian. For the first time since their marriage, she noticed complete confidence in his posture. He no longer carried himself like a man apologizing for existing. He stood like someone finally ready to reclaim the life stolen from him. Cecilia quietly slipped her hand into his. He smiled. Not because he could see her. Because he knew she was there. As the afternoon ceremony began, Theodore stepped onto the main stage to loud applause. His voice remained steady despite the enormous crowd gathered before him. He thanked guests for supporting decades of charitable work before unexpectedly announcing that today's celebration would not focus on business expansion. Instead, it would focus on truth. The applause faded. Confused whispers spread through the audience. Victor's confident smile slowly disappeared. Theodore invited Judge Leonard Barrett onto the stage. Then he invited Julian. Finally, he asked Cecilia to join them. 4 people stood beneath the bright afternoon sun. Thousands watched in complete silence. Victor felt something he had not experienced in many years. Fear. For the first time, he realized the celebration he had carefully planned might become the day everything he had built collapsed before the eyes of the entire world. The silence that settled over the Ashcombe estate felt heavier than any applause that had filled the gardens only moments earlier. Reporters lowered their microphones, guests leaned forward in their seats, and the members of the Ashcombe board exchanged uncertain glances. No one understood why Theodore had interrupted what was expected to be a celebration of the company's future. Only 4 people standing on the stage knew that the next hour would change the Ashcombe family forever. Theodore looked across the sea of familiar faces before speaking with quiet dignity. His voice carried none of the authority that had made him one of the country's most respected businessmen. Instead, it carried the weight of a grandfather asking forgiveness for mistakes he could never erase. He admitted that for years he had believed he had protected his family after tragedy struck. Looking back, he realized that grief had clouded his judgment. While mourning the loss of his son and daughter-in-law, he had trusted the wrong people and failed the grandson who had needed him most. He confessed that the Ashcombe empire had not been built merely on wealth, but on honesty, and if honesty no longer existed, then every success the company celebrated had become meaningless. The crowd remained perfectly still. Victor forced himself to smile. He stepped forward and politely suggested that personal family matters should be discussed privately rather than during a public charity event. His calm voice earned several approving nods from guests who had no idea what was unfolding. Before Theodore could answer, Judge Leonard Barrett opened a leather portfolio and carefully removed the original succession agreement. He explained that as a retired High Court judge and one of the original legal witnesses, he had recently been asked to review archived family documents. His conclusion was simple. The documents transferring authority away from Julian Ashcombe had been forged. A wave of astonishment swept through the audience. Board members immediately stood from their seats. Journalists rushed closer. Television cameras focused on Victor. Victor laughed softly and dismissed the accusation as an unfortunate misunderstanding involving outdated paperwork. He insisted that every legal document had been properly reviewed years earlier. Judge Barrett calmly nodded. Then he presented the forensic handwriting report. Independent experts had concluded that multiple signatures had been altered. Ink analysis confirmed that several pages claimed to have been signed years earlier had actually been produced much later. There was no misunderstanding. There had been fraud. Victor's smile disappeared for the first time. Still refusing to surrender, he claimed someone must have manipulated the archives after the fact. The accusation sounded convincing for only a few seconds. Then Margaret Ellis slowly walked onto the stage. Many longtime employees immediately recognized the elderly woman who had faithfully served Julian's parents for decades. Margaret described how Julian's father had become increasingly concerned about suspicious financial activity before the fatal accident. She revealed the sealed envelope he had entrusted to her, believing it might someday protect his family if anything happened to him. The letters, financial records, and handwritten notes were displayed on large presentation screens placed throughout the gardens. Guests watched in stunned silence. Several board members quietly compared the documents with company records they carried on their own tablets. Everything matched. Victor's breathing became noticeably heavier. He interrupted repeatedly, accusing Margaret of lying out of loyalty to Julian. Then another familiar figure slowly approached the stage. Arthur. The elderly groundskeeper stood before hundreds of guests with visible nervousness. His hands trembled, but his voice remained steady. He apologized publicly for remaining silent so many years. He explained that fear had controlled him after witnessing Victor arguing with Julian's father shortly before the fatal accident. Large screens displayed the restored photographs recovered from Arthur's hidden camera. The entire audience watched Victor angrily grabbing Julian's father's arm. Another image showed him attempting to seize the folder containing financial evidence. The final photograph captured Julian's parents driving away while Victor watched from the estate entrance. Victor immediately insisted that family disagreements happened all the time. He admitted they had argued. He denied everything else. The atmosphere became unbearable. Even people who had admired Victor for years no longer knew what to believe. Then Samuel Grayson stepped forward. The retired mechanic calmly explained the unexplained disappearance of Julian's parents' vehicle days before the crash. He described how someone claiming to represent Victor had removed the vehicle for supposed emergency maintenance that had never been performed. Although Samuel carefully avoided accusing Victor of causing the accident, his testimony reopened painful questions that had remained unanswered for years. Police investigators attending the event quietly exchanged serious looks. The reopened investigation had suddenly become far more significant. Victor realized the situation was slipping beyond his control. His polished confidence gave way to desperation. He accused Theodore of allowing grief to manipulate him. He accused Cecilia of marrying Julian only to gain wealth. He accused Julian of staging the entire investigation to seize control of the company. The accusations echoed across the gardens. For a brief moment complete silence followed. Then Julian slowly stepped toward the microphone. The crowd watched him with curiosity. Many had never heard him speak publicly before. He stood calmly beneath the afternoon sun, holding his white cane, his face composed with remarkable peace. He did not insult Victor. He did not seek revenge. Instead, he spoke about loss. He described waking in a hospital unable to see after losing both parents in a single day. He described spending years believing he had become a burden to everyone around him. He confessed that the greatest pain had never been blindness. It had been believing he was no longer worthy of responsibility. He explained that when people constantly tell someone they are incapable, even the strongest person eventually begins believing it. Many guests quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Julian then surprised everyone. He thanked Theodore. He thanked the employees who had remained loyal. Most unexpectedly, he thanked Cecilia. He admitted that she entered his life because of circumstances neither of them had chosen. Yet she never treated him like someone broken. She reminded him that leadership begins with integrity rather than perfect eyesight. Without her courage, he said, the truth would still be buried beneath fear. Cecilia felt tears rolling down her face. The applause that followed was unlike anything heard earlier that afternoon. It was genuine. Heartfelt. Earned. Victor looked around desperately. The board members who had supported him now stood silently. Several avoided meeting his eyes altogether. The company's chief financial officer slowly rose from his seat. With visible regret, he admitted that years earlier he had noticed irregular transactions but had accepted Victor's explanations without asking enough questions. One after another, senior executives began acknowledging questionable decisions they had ignored. The wall of silence Victor had relied upon for years was collapsing. Then the lead investigator from the reopened case quietly approached Theodore and Judge Barrett. After reviewing the newly presented evidence, authorities had obtained sufficient legal grounds to begin a formal criminal investigation into financial fraud, forgery, obstruction of justice, and possible involvement in the circumstances surrounding the decades-old fatal crash. Two officers walked toward Victor. The entire garden watched. Victor attempted one final escape. He insisted everyone was making a terrible mistake. He claimed the empire would collapse without him. He argued that everything he had done had been necessary to save the company. But no one answered. The officers informed him that he would need to accompany them for questioning. Victor looked desperately toward Theodore. The old man lowered his head. Not in hatred. In sorrow. Victor finally understood that he had lost the only thing he had truly wanted. Not money. Not power. Trust. As he was escorted away through the silent crowd, no one applauded. No one celebrated. The end of deception brought relief, but it also carried profound sadness. A family had been broken long before the truth finally arrived. When Victor disappeared beyond the estate gates, Theodore slowly turned toward the audience. With trembling hands, he unfolded the original succession agreement. Before every shareholder, every employee, every journalist, and every guest gathered beneath the afternoon sky, he publicly declared what should have been declared many years earlier. Julian Ashcombe had always been the rightful heir. The declaration echoed through the gardens with a power that no one present would ever forget. For several long moments there was only silence as every guest absorbed the truth that had remained hidden for so many years. Then, one by one, people slowly rose from their seats. What began as a few respectful claps became a standing ovation that spread across the entire estate. Employees who had served the Ashcombe family for decades openly wiped tears from their eyes. Many remembered Julian as a cheerful young boy before tragedy had changed his life. Watching him finally receive the respect that had always belonged to him felt less like a victory and more like justice finding its way home. Julian stood quietly while the applause continued. He had imagined this moment countless times during the lonely years after losing his parents, but now that it had arrived, he discovered he felt no desire to celebrate another person's downfall. His thoughts rested only on the family he had lost and the years that could never be returned. Beside him, Cecilia gently slipped her hand into his. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her presence alone reminded him that although the past could never be rewritten, the future still belonged to them. Theodore stepped forward once again and formally announced his retirement as chairman of the Ashcombe Group. He explained that leadership was never about possessing the sharpest eyesight or the loudest voice. It belonged to the person whose character remained steady when life became difficult. Looking toward Julian with unmistakable pride, he declared that his grandson had demonstrated more wisdom, patience, humility, and compassion during the previous few weeks than many executives displayed during entire careers. The board of directors immediately called an emergency session. After reviewing the evidence and the original succession agreement, every member voted unanimously to recognize Julian Ashcombe as the lawful chairman and chief executive officer of the Ashcombe Group. The announcement was met with another wave of heartfelt applause. Julian accepted the position with quiet humility. His very first decision surprised everyone. He refused to dismiss employees simply because they had once worked under Victor. Instead, he announced that every honest worker would keep their position. Only those proven to have knowingly participated in fraud would be removed after a fair investigation. He explained that fear often forces good people into silence. Justice should never become another form of revenge. Those words spread quickly through the crowd. Employees who had feared losing their livelihoods burst into relieved tears. Several walked forward simply to thank him. Over the following weeks, investigators carefully examined years of financial records. The evidence against Victor continued to grow. Millions had been hidden through shell companies and fraudulent contracts. Numerous forged documents were uncovered, and several former associates admitted they had been pressured into remaining silent. Although investigators could not conclusively prove Victor had caused the accident that claimed Julian's parents, the discovery of concealed evidence led authorities to officially reopen the case. The truth about that tragic day would continue to be investigated, offering hope that every unanswered question might finally receive an honest answer. Victor was ultimately convicted of multiple financial crimes, including fraud, forgery, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice. As he left the courthouse months later beneath another bright afternoon sky, there were no cameras celebrating his downfall. Public opinion had already turned away. The empire he had spent years trying to steal had vanished from his hands because it had never truly belonged to him. When Julian heard the verdict, he remained silent for a long time. Many expected him to express satisfaction. Instead, he quietly asked Theodore to visit Victor in prison. The elderly man looked surprised. Julian explained that hatred had already stolen enough years from their family. He wanted Victor to know that although justice had been served, forgiveness would always remain possible if genuine repentance ever entered his heart. Theodore carried that message himself. Victor listened without speaking. For the first time in his life, tears filled his eyes. Whether they came from regret or simply from realizing everything he had lost, only he truly knew. Life at the Ashcombe estate gradually transformed. The mansion that had once felt heavy with secrets slowly became filled with laughter again. Employees no longer walked through the halls with anxious expressions. Family meals returned to the long dining room. Theodore often spent warm afternoons telling stories about Julian's parents, sharing memories that grief had kept buried for years. Instead of causing pain, those stories gradually became treasured reminders of the love that had built the family long before wealth ever existed. Julian immediately began reshaping the Ashcombe Group. Executive bonuses were reduced so more resources could support employees and community projects. Scholarships were created for students with disabilities who dreamed of careers in business, engineering, medicine, and the arts. A rehabilitation center offering technology and career training for people with vision loss was established in honor of Julian's parents. Rather than allowing blindness to define limitation, the center became a symbol of opportunity, proving that determination could overcome barriers society often misunderstood. Cecilia played an equally important role. She declined every luxurious title offered to her. Instead, she chose to oversee the Ashcombe Community Foundation, expanding agricultural programs that supported struggling family farms across the region. She never forgot the fear of watching creditors threaten her own family's orchard. Hundreds of small farmers received grants, equipment, and education that allowed them to remain on land their families had cultivated for generations. Every successful harvest reminded Cecilia of where she had come from. Every smiling family reminded her why compassion mattered more than status. One peaceful afternoon several months later, Julian asked Cecilia to take him back to the orchard where her childhood had unfolded. The trees stood taller than ever. Fresh fruit covered nearly every branch. Children from neighboring farms laughed while helping gather baskets beneath the warm sunshine. Roland and Eleanor welcomed them with joyful embraces. After everyone shared lunch beneath the shade of the oldest apple tree, Julian asked Cecilia if they could walk alone through the orchard. They followed the same narrow paths she had wandered on the afternoon she decided to sacrifice her future for her family. Everything looked different now. Not because the orchard had changed. Because they had. Julian stopped beside one of the oldest trees. He gently reached into his pocket and removed a small velvet box. Although he could not see her face, he smiled as though he already knew tears were filling her eyes. Inside rested a simple wedding ring. Not expensive. Not covered in diamonds. Just beautifully crafted gold engraved with tiny apple blossoms. He explained that the ring from their arranged wedding represented obligation. This one represented choice. Months earlier they had married because circumstances demanded it. Now he wanted to ask the question neither of them had ever truly been given the chance to answer. He asked Cecilia if she would choose him again. Her answer came through tears before words. She slipped the ring onto her finger and embraced him as sunlight filtered gently through the branches overhead. Their family applauded from a respectful distance, understanding exactly what that quiet moment meant. Several weeks later the entire valley gathered for another wedding celebration. Not because the law required it. Because love deserved it. This time there was no fear. No whispered pity. No hidden motives. Only joyful faces surrounding two people whose greatest treasure had never been wealth but the courage to trust one another. The ceremony took place beneath a brilliant afternoon sky in the orchard where Cecilia had grown up. Children scattered flower petals along the grassy path. Friends and employees laughed together like one enormous family. Theodore watched with grateful tears, knowing his greatest wish had finally come true. The marriage that began through sacrifice had become a love story stronger than anyone could have imagined. Before this story comes to its close, take a moment to leave a meaningful comment. Tell us what touched your heart most. Do you believe kindness can change someone's destiny? Do you believe forgiveness makes a person stronger? Your words may become the encouragement someone else needs today. Years passed, but people throughout the region never forgot the remarkable story of the blind man everyone underestimated and the courageous young woman who looked beyond appearances. They became known not for their fortune but for their generosity. Whenever families faced hardship, the Ashcombe Foundation quietly appeared with support. Whenever a struggling farmer feared losing everything, help arrived. Whenever a young person living with a disability doubted their future, Julian personally reminded them that true vision begins in the heart, not the eyes. The old orchard continued to flourish, producing its sweetest harvests in generations. Theodore often smiled as children played beneath the same trees where Cecilia had once prayed for a miracle. He finally understood that miracles rarely arrive as sudden bursts of magic. More often they arrive disguised as difficult choices, quiet courage, patient love, and people who refuse to abandon hope. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Always remember that appearances can deceive, wealth can disappear, power can be stolen, but integrity, compassion, and genuine love remain treasures no one can ever take away. Sometimes the person the world overlooks is the very one destined to change it, and sometimes the hardest road leads to the most beautiful destination of all.